Hello everyone, Sidewin here. Today I'm going to be talking about Acrobatics in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. This is the first video in my series on skills in Pathfinder, and I'm just going to be going alphabetical order through these. This video covers specifically the actions and feats related to Acrobatics in Pathfinder 2e. It does not cover skill items, however I might eventually be talking about those in a separate video. So this video is useful if you're trying to learn how the skill works, what you can do with it, and what skill feats you can possibly take even as you go into somewhat higher levels. I'm starting with the actions. A quick clarification here. Untrained actions can be used by everyone. However, they are done at just the ability score modifier bonus. So for acrobatics, that's just your dexterity modifier, meaning that you're likely to fail at higher level DCs if you are untrained in a skill, even though you can do the ability. One thing to note with this is that some classes and the general feat Untrained Improvisation shift this by letting you add half your level to these untrained ability checks. So for instance, if you have Untrained Improvisation or level 10, you can add +5, whereas someone trained in athletics would add their full level plus the trained +2 bonus. So you're far less likely to succeed, but you still have a shot with Untrained Improvisation. Trained actions, meanwhile, require you to actually be trained in the skill. You can also be a higher proficiency. This does not shift things. I'm starting with the untrained actions here. For acrobatics, there are two of these, bounce and tumble through. Both of them take one action when performed in combat, but bounce is more likely to be used out of combat, while tumble through pretty much only occurs in combat because it's specifically moving through an enemy's space. I'm going to start by explaining bounce. Basically, bounce is triggered whenever your character is trying to move across a narrow surface, whether that's a tightrope or a narrow ledge. The effect of the action is you're off guard while you're bouncing because you can't effectively defend yourself using dexterity. This is essentially a -2 to AC. And you have to make an acrobatics check to move along your narrow surface. So on a critical success, you move up to your full movement speed. For most characters, that's 25 feet. On a success, you move up to half your movement speed, treating the ledge as difficult terrain. This secondary thing works out to, if you have a success each time, about 30 feet per minute for a 25-foot character. However, it can just work out to about 2 squares on the first round and 3 squares on the second round, due to the fact that 25 does not divide evenly into a multiple of 5 when you divide it by 2. On a failure when you do a bounce check, you must rebounce, spending your action and not moving, or fall off the edge. Falling off the edge automatically ends your turn even if you have additional actions. And if you're falling from a high height, you also lose hit points due to fall damage rules. The critical failure for bounce is basically you just fall, and you cannot choose whether to rebounce or fall. Most of the time, on average DCs for this ability, a trained character is unlikely to fall off the edge. However, in magical circumstances, as mentioned under the skill's actual description, many characters could take severe damage. The second action is tumble through. This is a one-action ability that is only really used in combat. Essentially, you move up to your speed with a stride action, including moving through the space of one enemy. Without tumble through, you must move around enemy spaces. But with this action, you can move through it. The way that works is you roll acrobatics against the enemy's reflex DC to see if you can dodge around them. If you succeed or critically succeed on the check, you then treat the enemy square as difficult terrain, meaning it takes 10 feet of movement instead of 5 feet of movement. So if you have a stride speed of 25 feet, then to move through an enemy, you have to spend 10 feet, meaning you can move up to 3 squares aside from the enemy square. So if you're 2 squares away from the enemy, move up to them with those 2 squares, and then spend 2 actions to move through. You still have 1 action to get beyond the enemy. For 20 feet of movement, this means you can only move a maximum of 2 squares in addition to the enemy square. So that's 3 squares of movement. And if you do not have the movement to move through the enemy square at the point where you reach them, then your movement ends and you trigger reactions as if you were exiting the square you ended on. So for instance, if the enemy has an attack of opportunity, you can be the victim of it because you tried to move through their space, but couldn't actually manage to. And on a failure, the same effect occurs. The failure state for tumble through is just provoking reactions, however. It does not necessarily mean that you're going to be grappled or otherwise taken by an enemy, since many do not have a lot of reactions to respond with. In addition to the untrained actions, Acrobatics has 2 trained actions. However, most characters are only likely to use one of them. That's Squeeze, which is a solely out-of-combat ability unless you take a skill feat, which I will mention later. Squeeze is basically when you try to move through an exceptionally tight space. The example given is for a train check in Squeeze. The biggest space you can be trying to squeeze through is one that barely fits your shoulders. By the time you reach the legendary level, it can be a space as small as one that barely fits your head. The way that Squeeze is mechanically resolved is you roll an acrobatics check versus the DC to squeeze through the space. On a critical success, you move 10 feet of distance in 1 minute. 1 minute is approximately 10 combat rounds, so that means you're spending about 30 actions to move 10 feet of distance. Usually when you're squeezing through an exceptionally tight space, it's not that long, however. Then, on a success, you move 5 feet of movement in the same 30 actions. So that's 10 turns for both of those. On a failure, you fail to fit in the hole, so nothing happens. But on a critical failure, you do manage to squeeze yourself in, but you get stuck, forcing another acrobatics check. As long as you don't roll a second critical failure, you get loose from being stuck in the hole, but you're likely going to end up back where you tried to climb into it. Generally, most GMs will let you just get out of it. A lot of them would probably let you reattempt the check so that there isn't the complication of trying to squeeze you out one way or another. But some GMs might choose to let you just get stuck if you tried to squeeze yourself in something you really shouldn't have. The second trained action is far more restricted. It's called Maneuver in Flight, and it's a one-action action. To use it, you have to have a flight speed, which is uncommon at low levels for characters. In fact, if you're playing any player ancestry, you can only get flight at the earliest around level 5 to level 7. Some ancestries wait until level 9, and permanent flight often waits until even later, with the earliest being around level 13. So usually you aren't going to be using this at low levels. The exception being is if you're using a fly spell or somehow got a higher level item that gives you a fly speed. The way that Maneuver in Flight works is basically you make an acrobatics check whenever you're trying to do an aerial maneuver. This could be something like flying against tough winds, diving, or otherwise something that just isn't easy. On a success, you succeed. On a failure, you fail. And the way that this works is similar to degrees of success in some other systems, which essentially sums up to success, you just succeed. Failure, you fail, but don't have a complete failure, like you're not falling out of the sky, you're still in the air. It's kind of like a success with consequences, but you don't really succeed. Failing forward, basically. And then a critical fail is literally the instruction to the GM is you fail, but the consequence is even worse. So this could mean, for instance, if you were trying to dive down to catch your ally, on a success, you dive down and grab them. On a failure, you dive down but fail to catch them. And on critical failure, you yourself slam into the ground. Different GMs will rule this differently, however, so don't consider that a word of God type situation. At this point, I'm going to move on to feats. My organization in this slideshow has been I sorted them by the level required to take them. Some ancestries and backgrounds, and your background gives you a skill feat at level 1. These are all level 1 skill feats. However, the first skill feat you are actually taking is at level 2, meaning for the skill feat you're actually picking, most of the options listed, basically all except the level 7 ones in the case of acrobatics, can be taken at that level. Additionally, most of these feats have a proficiency requirement. For instance, if you are trying to take, say, aerobatic excellence, that's a level 7 feat that upgrades maneuver and flight, you have to have at least master proficiency in the skill. The earliest you can get master proficiency in a skill is, I believe, level 7, but I'm likely wrong with that. So, the level 1 feats for acrobatics. The first one is Acrobatic Performer. The way this works is basically you can use acrobatics for your perform checks. So if you're trying to impress people with your acrobatic skills, like if you're doing a juggling show or something like that, you can use acrobatics instead of trying to roll performance. The way this additionally works is that you gain +1 to perform checks if you're using acrobatics, but also have proficiency in performance. This is a somewhat niche feat, which mainly applies if you're going to be trying to perform. The second feat is Catfall. Catfall basically means that you treat all falls as being 10 feet shorter. So on a 20-foot fall, you don't really take damage. At higher proficiencies in acrobatics, you treat taller falls as being nothing. So at expert, that's 25 feet, at master, that's 50 feet, and at legendary, you can never take fall damage, no matter how far you fall. So basically, this is just a way to protect yourself against taking damage when your bounce checks fail or you otherwise are falling. It can also be somewhat niche, like most skill feats in Pathfinder, but if you're doing a campaign anywhere with a lot of falls, it can be useful. Quick Squeeze is a feat which upgrades the squeeze action. Basically, it lets you squeeze 5 feet per round instead of 5 feet per minute. So that means that instead of moving 5 feet in 1 minute, you move 10 times 5 is 50 feet in 1 minute. By the time you reach legendary, you squeeze at your full speed, whatever that is, rather than the slower speed of 5 feet per round. Your full speed is 25 feet per round. So that means that you can move 250 feet per minute while squeezing at legendary proficiency. Steady bounce essentially makes it so that your bounce checks are more effective. Basically, it lets you not be off guard while performing the action, which could be useful if you're trying to, say, get above an enemy or otherwise move around the battlefield. Additionally, you get a critical success when you roll a success on bounce. The critical success effect is moving your full speed, so it essentially just increases your maneuverability around trickier battlefields. All of these level 1 feats are an option to take. The only one which would likely not apply in most campaigns is Acrobatic Performer. It's mainly a downtime ability, or some specific adventures might have some situation where you're trying to perform. But in general, if you're looking for a reason to not take a feat, Acrobatic Performer is one which you should consider based on your campaign, whereas the other 3 are likelier to be triggered in almost every campaign, because eventually there is going to be a precipice, or there is going to be a hole you're trying to squeeze through. The level 2 feats for acrobatics are pretty much in the same category as the level 1s in terms of whether or not you can take it. One that's somewhat notable is that Nimble Crawl requires expert proficiency, as well as tumbling teamwork. This means that usually you can't take these at level 2, since you usually can reach expert proficiency for the first time at level 3. However, I'm going to cover them all here. I'm going to start with Slippery Prey because it can be taken at that level 2 skill feat slot. The way Slippery Prey works is basically whenever you're trying to escape, which is a basic action that can be done with acrobatics or athletics, that's basically just trying to get out of whatever bond you've been put in, whether that's a pair of manacles, a rope tied around your wrist, or something more exotic, then your attempts are agile. Escape is a attack action, and using it applies multi-attack penalty, which means it's also affected by multi-attack penalty. What this means is that if you don't have Slippery Prey, your first attempt is at full bonus, your second attempt is at -5, and your third attempt is at -10. With Slippery Prey and Trained Proficiency, your first attempt to escape is at 0, second is at -4, and third attempt is at -8. Master Proficiency reduces this to -3 and -6. Legendary eliminates the penalty entirely, so you're always escaping with no penalty to your check, which can be useful if it takes multiple tries to get out of something. Some items have a specific rule if it takes a certain number of tries to get out. Now I'm going to talk about the other two. Nimble Crawl is similar to the previously mentioned abilities for Squeeze and Bounce, in that it lets you crawl up to 1/2 your speed rather than 5 feet each time you use the action. When you reach Master in Acrobatics, you move full speed, and at Legendary, you're not off guard while prone. So, crawl is basically moving while you're prone. It can be a way to stay out of sight, it can be involved in stealth, or it can be used to dodge ranged attacks, since ranged attacks have a penalty against prone enemies. Prone enemies generally are easier to hit, however, because they have the off-guard penalty. Once you hit Legendary, however, this makes it so there is no penalty. Tumbling Teamwork is an upgrade to Tumble Through. The way it works is whenever you tumble through an enemy, an adjacent ally can step. This can be a way to set up flanking. For instance, if you are on one square next to an enemy, then the enemy is in front of you, and your ally is perpendicular to the enemy, you could choose to tumble through, moving through their space, and with enough movement, you can move to one side or the other of the enemy that you tumbled through. So if you have the 9 square number around the enemy, you can allow your ally to step, creating a flank. That's the main use of this ability. It can also be used to get your ally out of trouble, since steps generally don't provoke reactions. One limitation of this, however, is it does not let your ally step away from the enemy. They have to remain within the enemy's adjacency range. So if it's a particularly large enemy, that can be a rather broad area. But for your average, medium, or small enemy, that's the 8 squares immediately around their central square. The last slide that I'm talking about here are the level 7 feats. These require higher proficiencies. One of them requires Expert, the other 2 require Master, and they are taken at higher levels. So fewer players are going to reach these. The first one I'm going to mention is Tumbling Theft. This is the one that requires Expert proficiency in Acrobatics. However, it also requires Expert proficiency in Thievery. So the likeliest characters to get this ability are Rogues or Investigators, or similar classes with large amounts of skills and a dexterity focus in many cases. The way it works is when you tumble through an enemy, you can try and nick something off them. This is usually a small item, although the rule says the GM is the ultimate decider of what you can nab. Generally, it's light or negligible bulk, so you might be able to take a potion off their belt or a key out of their pocket. This feat also gives you a +1 circumstance bonus to doing this. So when you roll through, they're distracted, and you have a higher chance of grabbing the item. The second general purpose feat in this level 7 set is Kip Up. It requires Master Proficiency and gives you the free action Kip Up. Basically, it lets you stand up without triggering reactions. One of the downsides of being prone is that when you stand up to reduce your penalties, you trigger reactions for many enemies next to you, namely attack of opportunity. So if someone like a Babao knocks you down, then if you stand up, they get to attack you again. And sometimes these attacks or other reactions have a rider effect that makes it so your action fails. This lets you completely ignore that and just stand up like normal. So if you're getting knocked down a lot, this is a good one to take if you happen to have master proficiency in athletics. The last feat in this list is Acrobatics Mastery. It gives a +2 circumstance bonus to maneuver in flight, and at higher proficiencies, it also lets you take more than one maneuver in a single check, although the DC is increased for each additional maneuver by +5, and it's maximum of 2 at Master Proficiency and maximum of 3 at Legendary. Generally, this feat requires you to have a fly speed, so fewer characters are ever going to get access to it. Thank you for watching. That was the full acrobatics deep dive in Pathfinder 2e. I will possibly talk about the items in a separate video, and I am going to be releasing additional videos on the other skills as we go along. Parts of this video might be released in different sections or otherwise broken apart. Thank you for watching.